1603, the beginning of the 17th century. Canada is inhabited by the Indians. In 1534, Francois I, King of France, began to take an interest in the New World and sent Jacques Cartier on a voyage of exploration. For a long time, hundreds of fishermen and traders from many European countries had been sailing to Canada every spring, and every autumn they went back to their homelands carrying with them rich cargoes of fish and furs, leaving Canada to the Indians and the snow. In the spring of 1603, among the fishing and trading boats that sailed for Canada, was one called La Bonne Renommée. On board, a young Frenchman making his first voyage as observer and geographer. He was King Henry IV's envoy, Samuel de Champlain. For some years, the center of the fur trade had been at Tadoussac on the St. Lawrence River. To Champlain, this seemed a natural starting point. It was here he first met the Montagnais and Algonquin Indians.
These people are of a happy disposition, always laughing. They speak slowly, as if to make sure of being understood, and often repeat their words.
Champlain proposed an alliance between the Indians and the King of France. The alliance was accepted and immediately celebrated with feasting and dancing in honor of the visitors from France. Then came the exploration of the Saguenay River.
All the land I saw consisted of mountains of rock, most of it covered with pine scrub. Most unpleasant country, where I didn't see 1 league of flat land on either side.
Champlain plunged into his work as geographer. First, he mapped the little port of Tadoussac, and then sailed up the St. Lawrence. On the way, he passed the Montmorency Falls, and finally reached Quebec.
The country is beautiful and flat, and the land better than anything I've seen so far, with plenty of woods and forest.
Following this route, Champlain passed the mouth of the St. Maurice, crossed Lake St. Pierre, and found himself at the Indian village of Hochelaga, later to become Montreal. Beyond Hochelaga, the Lachine Rapids brought him to a halt. They formed an insurmountable barrier. Beyond them, in the west, Champlain imagined a passage to India and China. Champlain believed in the existence of such a passage and wanted to discover it. But for the moment, that was the end of his first voyage. He went back to France. To acquaint people with Canada and its inhabitants, he published part 1 of his book called The Savages, or The Travels of Samuel de Champlain. Back in Quebec in 1608, he started to build his habitation, the first permanent building in Canada. A locksmith named Duval plotted to overthrow Champlain. But Champlain was warned of the mutiny in time, and Duval was sentenced to death and hanged. The habitation was completed in the autumn of 1608. Now Champlain and his men prepared for the Canadian winter, the colonizer's nightmare. The winter of 1608 was especially hard. Many of the men died.
Of the original 28, there only remained 8 of us, and half of them were sick.
10 of the men died of scurvy, 5 of dysentery. For the French, unaccustomed to it as they were, the winter was a long and trying ordeal. They waited for spring to open up the only highways of the time, the rivers. When the boats returned from France with supplies, Champlain would be able to re-establish communications with the Indians. Champlain needed the Indians because he knew that without them, it would be impossible for him to continue his explorations or to expand the fur trade. On the other hand, the Algonquins and the Montagnais accepted the alliance for military reasons. They wanted Champlain to make war on their enemies, the Iroquois. In a skirmish with the Iroquois, Champlain demonstrated a secret weapon, the arquebus. Terrified and astounded by the primitive but noisy firearm, the Iroquois turned and fled. It was a victory. The Algonquins, with their prisoners and the scalps of their victims, returned to Tadoussac, where they were greeted by their women who swam out to the canoes to share in the spoils. Champlain's Indian allies had got what they wanted, a resounding defeat of the hated Iroquois. Champlain had no interest in making war. He continued his explorations. He went up the Richelieu River, where he discovered a large lake, which he named Lake Champlain. He was more than ever convinced that he would find what he was looking for, a route to India and China. In 1610, he drew the first rough map of Quebec, based on fact and guesswork. In 1613, Champlain visited the territory of the Outaouais Indians.
We lit a fire to keep the mosquitoes away. These creatures maddened us with their persistent attacks.
During this trip, Champlain met the Indian chief Tessouat. Champlain was greatly interested by what the Indians told him. Without them, he would never have got to know this immense country he had been exploring for 10 years. Thanks to the Indians, he could now describe quite accurately the general topography of Quebec. He published part 2 of his book, The Travels of Samuel de Champlain. In 1615, Champlain and his Huron allies attacked the Iroquois.
Their village is enclosed by 4 stout walls of tree trunks, 30 feet in height.
This time, the Iroquois braved the firearms. Champlain was struck in the leg by an arrow, and the Hurons, carrying the wounded on their backs, were forced to retreat. For the French, it was a humiliating setback.
They make a sort of basket to carry the wounded, doubled over and tied up in such a way that it is impossible to move without great pain.
They arrived at the village of Cayagay on December the 23rd. It was during the winter of 1616 that Champlain studied the Indian ways, observing their dress, their dances, their great hunting expeditions. Quebec in 1620, Champlain undertook the construction of a fort on Cape Diamond. The fort overlooked the habitation and the river. Once it was built, Champlain hoped that Quebec would become the main fur trading center in Canada. Unfortunately, the fur trade, on which the merchants in France grew rich, did not even support the colonists. They had to learn from the Indians all the techniques that would make it possible for them to survive in their new land. It was not easy, and it was not much like the life Champlain had promised them.
Judge of the happiness Frenchmen will have once they get used to this place. Any man who has 30 acres of cleared land here, together with some livestock, hunting and fishing and trading with the Indians, could live 10 times as well as those in France who have an income of 20,000 livres.
The French who followed Champlain to Quebec never knew this quiet and pleasant life, but instead a life that was harsh and filled with pain. And such a life was of so little interest to the French that by 1624, the colony consisted of fewer than 60 people. In 1625, 3 Jesuit missionaries landed at Quebec. They were Fathers Lallemand, Brebeuf, and Massé. From the moment of their arrival, the Jesuits found themselves masters of a veritable kingdom. Several leagues of land were granted to them on the Beauport River. Under Louis XIII, the French began to take a real interest in their colony. In 1627, the Company of the 100 Associates was founded. Its purpose was to put into practice the colonial program drawn up by Champlain. The powerful Cardinal Richelieu supported Champlain's plans for expansion. But an English fleet laid siege to Quebec, and in July 1629, Champlain, his supplies exhausted, surrendered to Captain Kirke. The French had now been in Quebec for more than 20 years. There were a handful of settlers, together with about a dozen missionaries. Back in France, a few merchants had prospered from the fur trade. During the 2 years of English occupation, missionary work and colonization came to a standstill, though the profitable fur trade continued as before, under new management. In 1632, the war between France and England ended with the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Canada was returned to France. Champlain was delegated to Quebec. Then suddenly, in October 1635, Champlain was struck down by an illness which paralyzed him. Here lies Samuel de Champlain, born in Brouage, France, died in Quebec, Christmas Day, 1635. He has been called the father of New France.